prior to the pandemic, Bitcoin and other digital assets showed low correlations to traditional financial market variables, almost behaving as an entirely different ecosystem. However, Bitcoin has mirrored the sharp fluctuations in traditional markets this year, highlighting the tightening link between cryptocurrencies and the mainstream financial assets. For more on the recent performance of cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, we are joined by Farzam Ehsani, who is the co-founder and CEO of Valor.com. Farzam, thank you so much for your time. I mean, looking at the performance of Bitcoin and some of the other cryptocurrencies in recent weeks, what was driving the decline?
So we've seen a lot of volatility in financial markets overall, both in the traditional financial system as well as in the system of cryptocurrencies. And what we've seen over the last couple of years with COVID is that there's been a very accommodative policy from the central banks around the world, particularly the Federal Reserve. Now, what that meant was that interest rates were very low. There was a lot of money in the system through quantitative easing, where the central banks purchased financial assets to pump money into the system. And what we've seen now is that a lot of that money has found its way into financial assets. And we're also starting to see levels of inflation that previously we were not expecting. And so with the high levels of inflation, we've started to see the Federal Reserve and central banks start to put the brake pedals on a little bit. And what that means is that there are expectations for interest rates to go up, and as well as those quantitative easing or the purchases of financial assets to start easing as well. Now, the financial markets across the board, we've seen stock indices that have also come down in the double digits. That effect of the anticipation of the actions of central banks around the world, particularly the Federal Reserve, has caused a sell-off. And we've seen with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, it is one of the most volatile asset classes in the world that has not changed in the last week or two. And we've actually seen a pullback of over about 50% for Bitcoin. So in Rand terms, we saw a high in November of over R1 million per Bitcoin. And that came down to about 520,000 Rand in the last few days. And we're standing around over 570,000 Rand right now.
Right. Do you see a recovery? I mean, it was quite interesting to see the performance of Bitcoin when Fed Chair Jerome Powell was delivering his comments, and even afterwards. Do you see a recovery at some point?
Absolutely. I think, you have to put things into context. We're talking about an asset class that is just over a decade old. We're talking about an asset class that has properties of no other digital asset class, namely that it's an asset that individuals can hold in their own custody without having to depend on a third-party institution. Now, when you look at the valuation of all of the Bitcoin in the world, we're talking right now of just over $600 billion. We're not even talking about $1 trillion. This is not even as big as some of the biggest companies in the world. And when you compare that to an asset class like gold is standing at around $11 to $12 trillion. You've got to ask yourself, if Bitcoin really is a digital version of gold, and if it will start to take its place in the financial system as a hedge against inflation ultimately, then we're still in the very early stages. That's not to say that there won't be continued volatility to the downside as well. I'm not an oracle and I cannot say where the price will go in the short term. But in the longer term, there is certainly a thesis that Bitcoin will play a more dominant role in the financial system, and its supply cannot increase. It's programmatically scarce. So the only way it can respond to an increase in demand is through a rise in price.
On that note, then, for someone who's watching this conversation right now and thinking they want to have some exposure to the market and they're not sure what to do, how do they differentiate this particular performance that we've seen of Bitcoin versus the performance we saw in 2018? Is it the same performance? Is it the same effects? If not, then what's different this time around?
Yeah, in 2018, post the highs at the beginning or at the end of 2017 and the beginning of 2018, we actually ultimately saw a drawback of about 85% from the highs of Bitcoin at that time. So the highs were $20,000 at the time. The price went all the way down to about $3,000, just above $3,000. And then obviously right now we're standing at around $36,000 US right now. So the reason I share that is that the ecosystem has changed significantly. In 2018, it was predominantly a retail play. It was, people were talking about it over the Christmas dinner table, or in the United States, they talk about Thanksgiving, and they were having these conversations, but it was really just the retail play, the customers like yourself and myself. What we've seen since then is a lot of institutions come into this world, and we've seen a lot of hedge funds and asset managers allocate sometimes 1% to 2% of their portfolio to Bitcoin and to cryptocurrencies. So now when the price goes down, we see a lot of these asset managers and a lot of these institutional players, as well as the retail, more sophisticated players, view this as a buying opportunity. So it's very difficult to say whether we'll have a repeat. I think the fundamentals have certainly changed. We have seen drawdowns like what we've just seen, not just in 2017, 2018, but every few years in the crypto space. And then we have seen a subsequent recovery. That recovery sometimes does take months or years and not just days or weeks. So very difficult to say, but all fundamentals point to the fact that this is just another point in the cycle that we've seen several times over, and that we will see a recovery at some point in the future.
So as we speak right now, it's currently at just over $36,000. What's the next price level that you're looking at now?
I try to steer clear of price points, but if you do look at the pullbacks that we've seen in the past, then you can see it actually go much further down. On the upside, there are many calls for Bitcoin to be above $100,000 within the next year as well, and beyond that. So the range in projections of cryptocurrency, and particularly Bitcoin, is so wide because we're talking about an asset class that can go up or down by 10, 15, 20% in a single day sometimes. So very, very difficult to say. What I would say to viewers is that this is not a get-rich-quick scheme by any stretch of the imagination, and that one should understand what they're putting their money into before they do that. And so you could have much higher highs that I personally expect over the next few years. But please be careful of the volatility to the downside as well.
Farzam, thank you so much for that. Farzam Ehsani, who is the co-founder and CEO of Valor.com, talking to us about the recent performance he's seen in the price of Bitcoin, and also throwing in a sense of caution there for those of you who are looking at this particular space.